What do you think of the new background? Is it a bit more interesting? There's not much interesting in my apartment. I have, although I don't think I'm obsessive, I have a very obsessive kind of looking apartment. There was a guy came into my apartment. He was actually an actor. What was his name? Cameron, who played a serial killer in a series called Mindhunter. I don't know. I haven't seen the series, but he was this serial killer in that show, and he's a friend of a friend. And they were round in my apartment one time, and his immediate response to the apartment was, "This is the apartment of a serial killer." And he knows what he's talking about because everything is very organized. So it makes it difficult to find a good spot to kind of do anything that doesn't look just very like an Apple store. But you've got this. All right. It's 11 o'clock, so we'll get started. If anyone's watching for the first time, because I've actually had a few new people signing up, before I officially start, just let you know that once a month I give a seminar. And it's always connected in some way with my work and the work of pyrotheology, but also connects with the wider world of philosophy, psychoanalysis, theology. And I've been doing that now for about 3 years. And so you have access to all of those seminars. And occasionally I will release a seminar onto my podcast. There's a talks archive I have on iTunes or onto YouTube, but the vast majority are just for you guys. As I say, I'll maybe release 1 and 3 occasionally. After 6 months has passed, I'll release one. So all of them, the idea was, in the past I get to do 1 or 2 talks or even a day of talks, but it's very hard to keep building the work and to work with a consistent group of people over the course of a number of years to really get to the core of the thinking. Because it's all very well if someone hears me the first time and they hear me do some stories about Seamus and a little bit of stuff about doubt and unknowing, and that's maybe intrigues some people and they want to get deeper into the work. But in the past it was hard for them to do that, and primarily it was through books. Now it's through these seminars, so we can go as deep as we want. And some of you have been following my work and have been in the same field of work as me for a long time. And my hope is, this stuff's not easy. It's not like anything that hopefully has a little bit of depth. It's not easy. First time you read Kierkegaard, for example, it's going to be very, very difficult. But the idea is, if you stick with this for a few years, eventually it'll be like one of those 3D pictures that at first you can't kind of see the image, and then it kind of gradually appears. So that's what I'm hoping is happening. All right, so basically I'll get started. Let's take a pause, although I actually might include this little bit in the video because I think that's probably useful for some people. So I'll just kick on in. This month's Pyro seminar is called Confronting the Void. And it's a little bit of a kind of almost like a part 2 of what we did last month. It's also connected with what I've been doing in Coffee and Concepts. So if you've been following those, we looked at the gaze and we looked at the concept of dread. So this seminar is going to take on some of those themes that I've been touching on in Coffee and Concepts, and also building on some of the things that we looked at in the previous Pyro seminar. And what I'd like to do is start with this notion of the gaze. And I want to kind of give it a kind of definition of what this means. By the way, in film theory, there's a woman, Laura Mulvey, I think her name is, who does this stuff on the male gaze, which is loosely taken from Lacan, but it's not really. It's kind of it's something else. It's something different. So I'm not talking about that. I'm going to be talking about the phrase in its kind of proper philosophical context. But I'm going to refer it to some film theory. And so we're going to start with the gaze, going to look at how it's connected to dread, and then look at how that is all connected to what's called the technology of pyrotheology. The technology of pyrotheology being the way it's practiced in community, and the way it's practiced individually, and the way it's practiced in liturgy. So start with the gaze. What is the gaze? In a nutshell, I said I touched on this in the previous seminar as well, so I won't go into. I'll look at it from a slightly different angle, but in a nutshell, in order to become conscious of ourselves, we need to reflect. And by reflection, what I mean is, think of a reflection in a mirror. You have to throw something out into the world and then bring it back into yourself. So I was reading the concept of anxiety, and I'm actually going to reference that a little bit, maybe today and definitely in Coffee and Concepts this week. But Kierkegaard kept on using this term reflection in contrast to inwardness. Reflection was generally seen as a bad thing. And at first, I was really thrown by this because, in a very common sense way, reflection simply means to think, to actually be inward. So if someone is sitting reflecting, the first thing that comes to mind generally is somebody who is deep in thought, who is being inward rather than outward. So I kind of got caught up on kind of trying to really figure out why Kierkegaard was saying that there was a difference here and why reflection was not good, in contrast to also passion, which was. And as I thought about it, I was like, oh, right, okay, actually, technically the term reflection is about reflecting. In other words, you see something or you see yourself in a mirror and it's brought back on you. So there is an external dimension to reflection, whereas inwardness for Kierkegaard is not some sort of external thing, it's internal. And one way of approaching or beginning to approach what he means by reflection is to think that just as, and I've talked about this in previous seminars, Lacan talks about the mirror phase, where a child gets to know themselves by looking at the mirror of their siblings, or even a literal mirror in which their parents hold them in front of it and say, look, that's you, look how strong you are, look how great you are. But reflected in something in the external world, the infant begins to get a sense of themselves. And this is also connected with how Feuerbach thinks of religion, which is in order for the human, for society, for kind of the human essence to be revealed, it first has to be put out onto something, namely the screen that is God, and then brought back. And so for Feuerbach, reflection is happening, which is called mediation, right? So it's something that's immediate. You don't reflect, it's not outside and comes back. And mediation means there's like three parts. There's a distancing and there's a coming back. And even Freud sees this, Freud sees this in even the infant who plays, he sees one child playing this game called Fort Da, where the child throws a spool away from himself and then draws it back in. It's this presence and absence game. So for Kierkegaard, reflection isn't good, because what that means is, even if it's necessary, there's all these problems with it. Namely that we start to see ourselves externally, and we see ourselves reflected in society, and we judge ourselves in relation to the other. And as you probably know, even if you don't know much Kierkegaard, he's very suspicious of what he calls the crowd. He's very suspicious of people losing themselves by kind of projecting themselves into some sort of mass population, just thinking what other people think, retweeting what other people tweet, not thinking for themselves, but falling into what the herd thinks. And so reflection is a little bit like, I get to know myself by seeing you and judging myself in relation to you. And sometimes I'll judge myself well in relation to others and sometimes badly in relation to others. But I'm always kind of having a relationship with myself through a relationship with others. Now, when it comes to the notion of the gaze, Lacan is talking about this disturbing experience in which this reflection breaks down. There's something about this reflection that doesn't work, because what happens is I'm reflecting out. I'm feeling insecure as an infant. My body's not working the way I want it to work. I'm confused. Everything's chaos. I'm not in control of my life. But as I look out at adults and my older siblings and I see them interacting with the world, I get an image of wholeness. I get an image of something complete. I get an image of control. I get an image of being an agent within the world. And that helps me as I reflect, as I bring that into myself. I start to feel like an agent in the world. And say this can go wrong in that all we ever do is think that everybody else is great and I'm not, right? So the reflection is kind of failed in some way. I haven't brought that back into myself. Or I might have a very high opinion of myself and think that I'm fantastic and I'm great and everything's good. But I'm using this external image in order to kind of create an image of myself as, or an image of wholeness, an image of completeness, of agency in the world. But that image always has the potential of falling short. I mean, that's kind of what Kierkegaard calls dread, is the notion in which just this notion of everything's good and everything's fine and you can have a place in the world and you have a reflection of the mass who seem to know the answer and you kind of relate to that. This is all always fragile and has the potential of collapsing. And for the later Lacan, this experience can be called the gaze. And it's kind of like a gaze. It's like if someone looks at you, you're looking at someone in the park and they suddenly turn around and stare at you and you feel yourself looked at by another and suddenly you're disturbed. This is kind of an experience of the gaze. Actually, I'll tell you a story about what happened last night to me. I went out, there was a food truck outside. I went over to get some food and there was a guy there. He was a, probably homeless guy, looked like, pretty tough looking guy. And obviously on some drug and feeling a bit paranoid. And he started kind of threatening me. And at first it was all fine. I didn't feel too nervous and I talked to him. And if anything, from going to a bad school, you learn that the best way to not fight is to show no fear, no anxiety, and no threat. So you just do your thing. But he's staring at me, I'm staring at him, he starts following me around, and I turn around to talk to him, and then I notice that he has this 8-inch saw in his hand, and suddenly I was like, oh, I'm not in control of the situation, this is a little bit more nerve-wracking than I first thought. But I still kind of kept calm. There was a shop, which the shopkeeper had seen all of this, so he'd locked the door. But I walked towards the shop, wrapping a sweater around my arm in case I needed it. The guy unlocked the door and I went in. But I guess that experience of the blade was a type of experience of dread. Suddenly everything was fine, everything was good in my life, and I had no thought about myself dying. I was just literally going across the road to get something to eat. And even when he was threatening me, it still felt relatively under control, relatively fine. And then just the glance, because you get very myopic in those situations, as you know, so you're looking the person in the eye, but then, you glance to see any other threat and you're like, wow, how did I miss that? That is a very big threat that he just pulled out of the back of his jeans. And suddenly it's like you get this moment of everything could change. My life could just, potentially not end like that, but I could be in hospital in 10 minutes and this could radically change everything. And so there's just a fear in that, but there's also a experience of how life can just go in a very different direction. Suddenly you get a glimpse of potentiality. This is actually something I'm going to talk about tomorrow in Coffee and Concepts. But Kierkegaard talks about how humans are disrupted by the atom of eternity. And what he means by that is temporality, time, is just entropy. That's kind of all it is. Time is not even past, present, and future, because that's a spatialization of time. It's a wrong way to think of time. Time is this flow of entropy in the world. And if the experience of time is really just the experience of time that an animal has, no history, it's just this flow of entropy. And then Kierkegaard says eternity is very different. It is a singular moment that is full of every potentiality. And when he talks about human beings being between time and eternity, what he means is that Our temporality is disturbed by eternity. There's a contradiction, a synthesis he calls it. And the synthesis is the atom of eternity. And when you encounter the atom of eternity, you basically briefly glimpse kind of all of the possibilities that lie in front of you. You kind of suddenly realize your life isn't just on a normal track. There's all of these things can happen. And that, again, is what Kierkegaard calls dread, is the encounter with the atom of eternity that is in us. I think a good way to think about it is when you encounter, it's like cracking the atom. So there's a nuclear explosion. And for Kierkegaard, that's a very important thing to encounter. He thinks we spend most of our lives trying to avoid encountering this atom of eternity. It's kind of like an existential superpositioning, where you see momentarily that your life can go in all sorts of crazy directions. Anyway, that's a disturbing feeling, and that's kind of like the gaze. And what the gaze does is it reveals our own impotence to ourselves, and it reveals the impotence of the things that we value, the things that we think bring wholeness and completeness. It helps us briefly glimpse the kind of fantasy structure of our lives. And it's kind of disturbing. So I want to take 3 examples from movies, and then we'll move on. So one movie I'm going to use, because Todd McGowan refers to it in a short video that I recommended you watch alongside this seminar, is Citizen Kane. Now, by the way, before I get on to Citizen Kane, I'll say this is great movies generally can be seen as helping you encounter the gaze. That's kind of like the almost unique aesthetic dimension to movie making, right? Is it's very, very connected to this notion of the gaze. And the reason for that is movies do fascinate us. We see ourselves reflected in the movies that we watch. So whenever I go to a movie that I like, it's not just I'm passively watching it. In some way it reflects back my values to me, and so I'm hooked into it. That's why movies are great to watch to understand the ideology of a culture. They're not very useful to understand how we should desire or how we should be. They simply are reflections of how we do desire. They're reflections of the ideological moment. They're like a snapshot, a Polaroid picture of the ideological space the society inhabits. So when you go, that's why Zizek does a lot of analysis of movies, because they're a great way of analysing contemporary ideology. So when you go to a movie, it captures your gaze, right? It captures your desire. It reflects that desire in some way, and it satisfies it, even at just a phantasmic level. It kind of, just like a dream can, if you're thirsty and you dream of drinking water, it's not as good as drinking water, but in a phantasmic kind of way, you do get some satisfaction, right? You're at least in the imagination. So the movie can link your desire, grasp your desire like a hook. It can evoke it, incite it, ensnare it, and manipulate it, right? But most movies we watch, that's what they do. They're actually designed not to help you confront the gaze, right? So the movie gives you the fantasy, it gives you the desire, it gives you the reflection of wholeness, the hero and the heroine who you can look up to and admire, who somehow grasps the ideological the ideals of your society and yourself. So that's most Hollywood movies. But some movies expose the gaze, and these are often considered to be the great movies, right? A great movie does that. So Citizen Kane is an example of a movie that's seen as one of the greatest films of all time. And it has a very obvious example of this, where Charlie Kane, who's this incredibly rich kind of media mogul, is on his deathbed. And he has everything he could possibly want. He has money and he has authority and he has this reputation. And yet when he's dying, he says the word rosebud. And rosebud signals or signifies something that he desires more than everything he has. Right? There's some melancholy in that word. What is rosebud? And this guy goes off in search of it. He goes like, I'm going to find out, what is it that this person who seems to have everything, what is it that they are missing? What is it that they are desiring? You know, their desire should be completely satisfied by everything they have. And at the end of the movie, he hasn't figured it out, right? And he kind of goes, maybe we'll never know who or what Rosebud is. And then the closing scene of the film is when we see some of Charles Kane's possessions being either separated for auction or destroyed if they were worthless. And so a sledge is picked up, and a guy says, oh, it's just junk, throw it in the fire. Throw it in the fire, and you see that the name of the sled is Rosebud. And you kind of are confronted with this idea that, oh, the thing that this guy wanted most of all was a piece of junk. It was an old sled. Now, it was an old sled that was connected to his childhood and to innocence and to all of that. But ultimately, it wasn't something wonderful and amazing. It's just an old piece of wood, right? And so you're kind of confronted with this truth of our desire, that what we desire, the wholeness and the completeness, is a type of fiction. It covers over a lack, right? It covers over something, so you're confronted with that. Another famous example is the film Vertigo, where basically a man falls in love with a woman who doesn't exist. She's just a fiction that's created to ensnare his desire. And as the film moves on, we realize, or we realize through him, we already know, but we see him realize that the one he loves more than anything is simply a memory, is simply what's called a simulacra, a copy of something that doesn't even exist. It's just a woman there's a real woman who was acting this woman. She was playing a part, and he fell in love with the part. And, and the film plays around that kind of theme. But even Fight Club could be seen as confronting the audience with the impotence of the gaze, or the experience of the gaze. Because maybe in two ways. So in Fight Club, the protagonist sees through all of the things that should bring value, the things that we value in society, nice house, all of these, the perfect possessions, a job with security, basically he has all of this, the normal things, and we experience through him their utter impotence. But also then we discover that, his resistance against that and his desire to destroy everything, as well as another kind of a way of attempting to find ultimate meaning. And then we discover again the impotence of that. And so in Fight Club, you kind of encounter the gaze twice. And I think that's partly why it's such a powerful movie. And then one more is a French film by Celine, Celine Sciamma, called Portrait of a Lady on Fire. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the outline of the film, and then if you haven't watched it, the other ones I don't mind because they're super old. If you haven't seen them, spoilers, doesn't matter. But this one, if you want to watch the movie and you don't want any spoilers, I'll tell you when to stop watching this, and you can just fast forward 5 minutes, right? It's Portrait of a Lady on Fire is about this young woman, Eloise, who is to be married to this kind of aristocratic figure. And this woman, I think her name is Marianne, is going to paint her portrait. And the portrait's going to be sent, I think, to her husband-to-be. And the whole movie is about the love affair that kind of grows, or the palpable desire that grows between the artist and Eloise, right? So at this point, stop watching if you don't want to have any spoilers, and say jump forward 5 minutes. So one of the central parts of the film is it's kind of loosely based on a Greek myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. And the story of Orpheus and Eurydice goes like this. Orpheus is the son of Apollo, And he has this gift of music, and he has a lyre, or a lyre, is it called lyre, you call it, where he can play incredible music that seduces anyone and anything. And anyway, Orpheus falls in love with Eurydice, and they have a short but passionate and very happy marriage. But they are told by a prophecy that this will be short-lived. And sure enough, one day Eurydice is out dancing with the nymphs in the forest, and she's accosted by somebody, and in trying to get away from this guy, she's bitten by a snake and she dies. And she goes into the underworld. Well, Orpheus is distraught, and Orpheus decides to go into the underworld and rescue Eurydice. But this is almost impossible for any normal mortal, and most gods, you would die by going into the underworld. But Orpheus is protected by the gods and is strong and is courageous and goes into the underworld. And through his music, he's able to win over Cerberus, the three-headed dog of hell. He's able to survive in the underworld and eventually meets Hades. And Hades is won over as well by Orpheus. So Orpheus has gone through all of these trials, like sacrificed everything and basically almost died to get Eurydice back. Now Hades takes a liking to Orpheus and says, okay, I'll let Eurydice leave. And this doesn't usually happen, but I'll give you one chance. But in order for Eurydice to leave, you have to do one thing. And Orpheus is expecting something very difficult. He's already done incredibly difficult things, so he's expecting something tough, and he's ready for it. And Hades says this. He says, all you have to do is walk out of Hades, and Eurydice will follow you. Play your music, and she will follow you out. That's all you have to do. But don't glance back. If you look back even for a moment, Eurydice will be kept in the underworld forever. So super easy. Well, Orpheus is walking towards Earth, out of the underworld. Eurydice is following him. And just when he's a few steps away, he thinks to himself, is she really behind me? Can I really hear her footsteps? And he looks back just to see, just to glance, just to make sure that she's following him. Sure enough, he sees her. And then she is pulled back into Hades forever. Right. Now, this story is part of the movie, right? So this is being told within the film. And whenever it's told, this maid, who's part of the movie, she says, oh, Orpheus is an idiot, right? So the maid basically does what Watson does in Sherlock Holmes, or the police officers in Columbo do. You always have to have a figure who says the obvious interpretation, right? So that the true interpretation, the smart interpretation comes out by the other person. So she's the Watson, and she says, well, Orpheus is just an idiot, right? He's too weak, and he's too impatient, and he looks back to see her, and it's all lost. So just an impatient idiot. And Eloise says, well, no, maybe Orpheus wanted the memory of Eurydice more than the person. All right? So this is the point when the truth of the movie is revealed. Because this is really the truth of the two protagonists, right? They are the artist and Eloise. That it's a doomed love affair, but in a way that's what they want. Because if it doesn't work, if they're apart, then they can keep the dream alive of how amazing it could have been, right? So in a way, the film very subtly confronts you with the impotence of our fantasies, of the wholeness of a love affair, of what could have happened. Now, it's subtle, but it's there. And so there's something very traumatic about the movie. There's something very traumatic because on the surface level, they can't be together. But there's something even more traumatic that if you're watching carefully, you encounter, which is, oh yeah, they couldn't be together even if they were. Because if they ended up together, it would be a disaster. But what they then did, and Eloise knowingly did, is let her go in order to keep a memory alive. But a memory of what? In a way, a memory of something that never even existed. A memory of what could have been. A memory of a future that never happened. So it's not a copy of a reality. It's a simulacra, which is a copy of something that didn't exist. A copy of a copy. So again, in a film like that, you cinematically get a glimpse of the gaze that's disruptive. Now, you know, if you followed my work for a while, you know that one of the ideas here is actually, while this is very traumatic, it's actually very freeing. So in your life, if there's something, some memory you have of a time, it's actually not really a time. Like, there's people who have memories of their relationship with their ex-wife or ex-husband that is a memory of something they never had. Once they've broken up, they weirdly are caught up in this memory of some beautiful time that actually didn't really exist, right? Or we can do that with childhood, or we can do it with, if only I'd been with that person, someone that you couldn't be with. You suddenly have a memory almost of how it could be, but it's not a memory of anything real. And actually seeing through that and realizing, well, something can be good and you know, could have been good if you were with that person, but it would not be the reflection that you've created, the ideal reflection that you are immersed in and you're drawn by. That's a type of fiction. And so you glimpse that, and it kind of like breaks you out of that frenetic death drive for wholeness and completeness and satisfaction, right? It allows you to make peace with a lack within you, not a loss. A loss is losing something that you had. A lack is a gap that it didn't exist. It's a gap that's constitutive of who you are. So you're able to make peace with that gap. Now, the example that Lacan uses to kind of talk about the gaze is this very interesting painting by Hans Holbein called The Ambassadors. Now, this painting is interesting because when you look at it, it looks like a very standard painting of the time. There are two ambassadors, and they are young and they are strong, and they are standing in a very strong pose. And they have very rich clothing, like symbolic clothing of authority. And they're also surrounded by all of these symbols that represent learning and represent culture and represent power. So you're looking at two people who are the pinnacle of the society that they're in, right? But there's also this blur in the photo, in the bottom of the photo, and you can't make out exactly what it is. It's just this weird kind of looks like a mistake in this perfectly drawn painting, this weird kind of blur of color that makes no sense at all. But if you reposition yourself in relation to the painting and you look at the painting from the bottom left-hand corner, looking up, that blur turns into a perfect skull, and the skull is looking back at you. That picture is like an image of the gaze, that you're looking out at something that seems perfect and great and wonderful, that you're caught up in, that you're mesmerized by, an image that ensnares you. And then you're ensnared by it, but suddenly you see a gap within it. You see a lack, and the lack looks at you. This skull, a symbol of nothingness, the real death, right? This gap you feel. And it's a shock. Again, it's similar to what maybe Kierkegaard would call dread. It's this shock that shocks you out of your complacency. It's painful, but also it's a liberating experience, because you realize that all of these things that you're chasing for wholeness and completeness, they don't work because they are incomplete in and of themselves. If you got all of that stuff, there's still a lack that is within it. Because there's something about being human that is being at contradiction and not at oneness with the world. So you can never get that oneness. I mean, this is why, by the way, Kierkegaard is against paganism, Gnosticism, New Age thinking. Because those things, and by the way, for Kierkegaard as a Christian, he would see really all institutional Christianity as Gnosticism. He would see it as an attempt to kind of move away from dread, right? Because for him, Christianity is a very precise thing, and part of Christianity is about acknowledging the contradiction that we are, the not at oneness with the world that we are, where he talks about we are between mind and matter, and we are between time and eternity. Spirit, which is the contradiction of those things, right? The contradiction of mind and matter, and the contradiction of time and eternity in the subject of spirit. And the evidence of spirit is anxiety or dread. And instead of trying to run away from dread, it must become our teacher. It must become our friend. We must learn how to live with it and live within it. And there we find a connection with the absolute through inwardness. We connect with the spirit, which is contradiction. So it's very, very different from, confessional Christianity. That's why when Kierkegaard died, people didn't want him buried in the church, because they saw him as the enemy of the church. And he was very, very critical of institutional religion, and yet unapologetically Christian. So why was I saying that? Oh yeah, so the gaze is the thing that confronts us with the contradiction that we are, through seeing it in the ideal that's outside of us. And so now I want to come to explicitly pyrotheology and the technology of pyrotheology, how it's played out in a liturgical form. And what I want to say is that, and hopefully this is the clearest way I've ever said it, is if you want to have an idea of what the pyrotheology in practice looks like, it's Hans Holbein's The Ambassadors, right? You think of the liturgical structure as the painting. People go into church and they go into a movie and they're projecting their ideals and their desires onto the screen of the liturgy. And the liturgy is hooking that desire. It is allowing that desire to find a place within it. But then the liturgy enacts a direct confrontation with a type of internal lack. Now this is what, and Luther, this is the one verse that supposedly terrified Luther the most when he preached it, was the verse, my God, why have you forsaken me? Because Luther understood that that is the most profound statement probably in the New Testament. It is the moment when you see within the ideal that is God, a gap that stares back at you. And so it's very, very traumatic. That is the skull in Holbein's The Ambassadors. So the idea for the leader is to construct a liturgy that kind of does three things. One, it captures the person's desire. It captures the person's notion of God. So it enacts what's called the Deus Ex Machina, what Bonhoeffer called the Deus Ex Machina. The liturgy kind of enacts the religious God in some way. Two, it allows for transference. So it allows people then to find their desire within the liturgy, their desire for the ideal God who'll fix everything, who'll make everything good, who allows us to understand who we are in our perfection. And then three, it confronts us with the gaze. It confronts us with the gap that's within that. And then the congregation enter into what Hegel calls absolute knowledge. I think salvation, which is the experience of the loss of perfection, the embrace of the contradiction, and then freedom from their frenetic pursuit of finding something that will make us whole and complete, whether it's money, fame, people, whatever. But while keeping our desire alive, that's very key. This is very key in Kierkegaard, is like we can desire, but we desire without end. A great example of this, by the way, I think a really good example of this is language, right? What is meaning, right? So all language is signifiers, right? Words. And they're strung together, right? Now, where does meaning arise out of? Like in our heads, we almost think that there's some words that just connect with reality. But words don't connect with reality. Words just connect with other words. If you read a dictionary, right? If you try to learn language by reading a dictionary, every word in the dictionary, if it's complete, just points to other words. There's no word that you get to which is somehow rooted in the real, that you just read and completely understand what it means in terms of its reality outside of language. There is no outside of language. It's just words connecting with words. But in the ongoing failure of finding some end, some point in which meaning is coupled with the world, that process generates meaning. It's the literal stringing of words together that generates concepts and ideas and meaning. And so this weirdly means that sometimes we can feel that we can never express ourselves. We can never express who we are to another person or to ourselves, because there's something elusive in language that means there's always miscommunication. You can't get away from it. You can't have pure communication. And yet it's in that miscommunication that communication occurs. I think it's a similar way to think about in relation to desire. We're thinking about finding something that will give us pleasure, ultimate pleasure, but it's actually the vocation of struggle and engagement and finding a vocation and finding something to give your life to that never ends, but in the never ending and the giving yourself over to the work, pleasure is produced as a kind of epiphenomenon, as a surplus to what you're doing. So you can never pursue happiness directly. You'd be unhappy. It's only a surplus that you find through giving yourself over to work. Just like meaning is never found by the precise word. Meaning is you give yourself over to just speaking. You don't think about it. You give yourself over to speaking and meaning kind of arises, but also with miscommunication. Right? So the vocation of the person who does pyrotheology is to give themselves over to this kind of three-part structure. Is they help people to by reflecting the ideals of the people they're working with. They allow for the transference to happen, so the person links in their desire into the image. They reflect it back to themselves, and then you help them encounter the gaze by showing the type of impotence that lies within that ideal. And when you do that, the person experiences a freedom, what Kierkegaard calls a qualitative leap, which means a radically different form of being in the world. You no longer, so something I said the other day in Pints and Parables, but I'll repeat it here. Because, by the way, that's what a parable does. A parable starts usually with what everybody thinks, right? So it starts by giving the view that is common. And then once you see yourself as the protagonist in the parable, then the parable at the end turns it, and suddenly you see that it's the other way around. You see a completely different way of thinking, right? So a parable hooks you in by giving you your ideal. It allows the transference to occur, and then it twists it. And a qualitative leap means that you move from one way of being to another. So if you take the word apocalypse as example, that if you have an apocalyptic idea or movie, the idea is the whole world is destroyed, and then at the other side of a new world is created. So in some apocalyptic sci-fi, the world's blown up, but eventually the aliens are defeated, and on the other side we have a better world. A world where people are less violent, less in pursuit of things, or more family-oriented or something like that, right? Or there's less need. But the issue with that is, in a way, everything's destroyed except for the way we desire, right? We're just unfulfilled here, and then we're fulfilled after the apocalypse. A truly apocalyptic moment, in religious terms, is when nothing necessarily is destroyed in the world, but you're absolutely destroyed and reconfigured. So the way you desire is different. So it's not that you just desire and you don't have what you want until the next life. It's that you don't desire in the same way at all. There's a different form of desire arises that frees you from the kind of like being lost in the crowd and being lost in the herd and being lost in the frenetic pursuit of happiness. And that's the salvation of theology, I think. All right. I think that's basically what I want to cover. My goodness, I was talking for a while. I'm just going to see if there's any questions in the chat box, and then I'll let you go. Hey Seamus, how's it going? Good to see you. I'm glad you're enjoying it. I don't know when you wrote that. Hopefully you still enjoyed it after you wrote that. So Tim says, is gaze an event and dread that feeling that results from the gaze? You know, so I'm using two terms from two different people. So Lacan is the gaze and Kierkegaard is more dread. They're all interconnected. But because they're coming from two different people, I don't think it's as neat as that. For Lacan, I think the gaze is the experience of the experience of the impotence in the reflection that's felt back. And rather than the gaze being something objective and then dread being the feeling, I think the feeling is in what Lacan calls the gaze has the feeling of dread within it. They're just used to slightly different purposes, so I think they're basically the same. It's just Kierkegaard is thinking more about freedom, and he's thinking more about experiencing ourselves as having infinite potentiality and having to figure out how we cope with that. We don't want to cope with that, we want to avoid it. So I think, basically I would say that dread is a type of confrontation with the gaze. As far as I can see, they're pretty much actually kind of the same thing. Oh yeah, Tim says Israel had a memory of Egypt that didn't exist, right? That sounds like it could very well be true. My recollection of the Hebrew scriptures is pretty poor, but I think that sounds probably very right. Apollo says, this talk reminded me of two things. Pete's article in Caputo's It Spooks and Adam Phillips' book's Missing Out in Praise of an Unlived Life. Yes, that's very good. Yeah, Adam Phillips' book in Praise, Missing Out, is a good example of, I think it's a great example of what Kierkegaard means. You can make these connections. I mean, I do think that like existentialism, psychoanalysis, radical theology are in the same wheelhouse and they're all drawing from Hegelian philosophy. And what Adam Phillips does really beautifully in that book, Missing Out, is he says that we live between who we are and who we'd like to be, and we live between what we have and what we would like to have. And, instead of the idea of us trying to move to one of those poles, Adam Phillips is basically saying we are the in-between. And that's what Kierkegaard calls spirit. That's literally, I love this, like Kierkegaard gives a very precise definition of spirit, and it is, he calls it the synthesis of the contradiction between basically the poles that Adam Phillips mentioned. So yeah, absolutely, 100%. Rob says, is propaganda a way of, I know where you go, is propaganda a way of concealing the gaze in the way popular films do in order to manipulate desire for the sake of ideology? Absolutely. I think, propaganda is, ultimately, its desire is to cover over the contradiction and that the gaze offers, or probably basically, or reduce the contradiction to opposition. So what it does is it evokes the contradiction, but it then says that the contradiction is not something that is ontological. It is unnecessary, it's accidental, and it's related to those people over there. And it can be, it can be Republicans, it can be immigrants, it can be, it can be anybody. It's whoever, whenever the contradiction is reduced to opposition. So you could say that that's what propaganda is. It actually wants to evoke the gaze. In a way, it actually wants to evoke the dread. It wants you to feel it, and then it wants to give you a false solution to it. And so, there you go. And I think a lot of journalism, the worst kind of journalism, does exactly the same thing. Yeah, so that would be a way of, I think, describing it. Seamus says, can the crucifixion be seen in light of the atom of eternity? Yes, very much so. This is all connected. This is why it's very difficult to work out what exactly Kierkegaard meant by Christianity. Sometimes, because he was unapologetically Christian, just like Hegel was. I think it's really funny, by the way, you see a lot of progressive and liberal Christians who don't want to, use the word Christian and kind of like avoid it and move around. And then you get people like Zizek and Todd McGowan and Hegel and Kierkegaard, who are unapologetic about using the terms, and they're all very different. She's ex-radical atheist, Todd McGowan's atheist, no involvement in the church. Then you've got Kierkegaard, who's radically Christian but hates the church profoundly, and then you have Hegel, who sees himself as a good Lutheran but really is just doing philosophy. But all of them use the term. There was actually a podcast that Todd McGowan was on recently. It was very funny listening to it, because the interviewer said, it almost sounds like you're saying Christianity is kind of the right answer. And Todd McGowan says, I'm not almost saying it, I am saying it. But he kind of laughingly said it, because he doesn't mean Christianity as a religion. He simply means, I think Hegel's right. I think he's like, I think Hegel's, and it's just funny hearing someone like that, who's not involved in Christianity at all, in a confessional sense, or any of the beliefs, kind of being happy to use the term. Just like he'd be happy to use the term Hegelian. And so Kierkegaard uses this term, but it's very hard to figure out what he means by it, because he's so avoiding any connection with the institutional church. But one way of cracking that is to see that the idea of the crucifixion is the contradiction. I mean, it's the contradiction in so many ways: time and eternity, mind and matter, the highest and the infinite and the finite. The crucifixion is the synthesis, in Kierkegaard's terms. Hegel doesn't use that term, but Kierkegaard uses the term, the synthesis of the contradiction. And so in the same way, the atom of eternity is basically, and by the way, this is hilarious, when you read Kierkegaard and Hegel, they predict kind of modern science, because they see contradiction embedded within reality itself. So quantum mechanics is not some kind of a weird kind of unthinkable kind of empirical reality. No, it's very thinkable. It's very much what Hegel spent his entire life doing, is showing how reality itself has contradiction within it. And so the crucifixion is the superpositioning of time and eternity, mind and matter. And it is the point at which we supposedly, symbolically couple ourselves with God, who then God dies. We experience the gaze in the crucifixion, and we're freed in order to be able to live in love with one another, freed from the frenetic pursuit of wholeness, which is the collective of the Holy Ghost. So the cross is the place of salvation, in the sense of it's the place in which you encounter the radical not at oneness of the one. And that's why Kierkegaard stands against all forms of paganism, which are, there is a oneness, we're connected with the earth. If we're not connected with the earth, it's because we are out of balance with the world, but we can be balanced, we can be fully immersed in the world. Gnosticism, which is paganism Gnosticism's paganism reintroduced into Christianity. So Gnosticism is any Christianity that has that idea of balance, wholeness, oneness built into it. And Kierkegaard stands fundamentally against that. It's very funny, because Kierkegaard goes, the core of Christianity is dread. It's I think he suffered a lot from anxiety, to be honest. I think you can read his dread in a less terrifying way. It's just basically being confronted with the contradiction, and that's what the crucifixion is. Oh, John says, is gaze closely related to the non-duped heir? I noticed about your movie Alone. I see the woman as superstitious and myself as rational, but she can only go on the journey because of superstition. This is great. So first of all, so John's referring to this notion of Lacan's, the non-duped heir. And very briefly, it's if someone suffers from, or if someone's within a psychotic structure, which a lot of people are, nothing wrong with it, we're all in some structure. But if you're caught in a psychotic structure, one of the problems you have is seeing the authority of another. If you're looking at a police officer, you just see a police officer. Or if you see a judge, you just see a judge. And it's called the non-duped heir because that sounds like the name of the father, and there's this whole connection. But really what it means in a very practical sense is you're not duped, because it is just a police officer, a teacher is just a teacher. They're not your mummy, right? You know, most people have had that terrible experience. They put up their hand and say mummy whenever they're trying to say teacher, right, when they're a kid, because you're symbolically identifying the teacher with an authority in your mother. But some people, they can't do that. They just go, it's just a teacher. And so it's very hard because you have to still obey the teacher or you'll get in trouble. But you can't kind of get into the transference. And it's called the non-duped error because you're going to get in trouble, right? You kind of like, you err by literally by not being duped. If you're duped, you're less likely to err. And yes, John's connecting that with the film Alone, which I think I'll show to everybody on Patreon at some point, the woman who basically her child is suffering, she needs a cure for her child. The only way she can find the true cure, which is a confrontation with the gaze, which is realization of death at the heart of everything, and that everyone carries that death. So that's what this basically Alone is. I mean, it's exactly what I'm talking about here, to be honest. It's the journey from looking for the thing that will fix everything to confronting the impotence of the ideal, to then finding some sort of way to mourn, to put words to that, to find community around that, right? That's the whole movie in a nutshell. And the woman, as she has to find these seeds from a home that hasn't been touched by suffering and loss, but every home she goes to has been touched by suffering and loss. And that's how she gradually is able to move I basically have a qualitative leap, actually, which is what Kierkegaard is about, a qualitative leap from finding the answer to being in a place where the answer is there is no answer, is related to the fact that she's caught up in the desire, and then there's a wise woman who helps very indirectly to break that. So John, what you're asking, I think, is what happens if you can't get into the transference? If you like the job, like I mentioned, of a parable, is it hooks you in with your desire, you relate to it, you move along with it, and then it throws you, and then you experience the qualitative leap. Then those with ears to hear will hear the qualitative leap. If you can't do that, then there's just a different strategy. And you're talking about it. And so I think I should have to do a whole talk on that at some stage. I think to some extent, here's the thing: whether someone is more neurotic or more psychotic, it's the same. It's coming to terms with the lack, but the way it looks is different, and the way one does that is different, and and so you're asking a very, very good question, and a difficult question. But just to clarify again, because I think it's very, very good, what John is saying is, in something like Alone, the woman is looking for the answer, right? Bring back my child. This wise woman says, I can help you, but find these seeds from a home that hasn't been burned by the black sun of suffering that has scorched your life. So the woman says something that's non-committal. It doesn't say, I can bring back your child, and doesn't say, I can't, but says, I can help you. Allows the woman to fantasize that what she means is the child will come back, the transference, then goes out into the world, and the words of the woman have allowed her to talk to others, to symbolize the loss, to encounter other people's loss, and so eventually she becomes free herself, right? So that's the standard move. If you can't, as I say, fall for the fantasy, if you're non-duped at the beginning, then there's a different process, and I'm going to have to think. This is the difficulty in psychoanalysis between working with someone who has a psychotic structure and a neurotic structure, because if you get someone with a psychotic structure to begin to doubt and question, it can cause a break. It doesn't work. So what you have to do is help them confront the lack in their own way. And I'm trying to think, but I'm just fascinated because this is a question I was talking to a friend of mine, Chris Fry, about. He's a psychoanalyst, and Yeah, it's a tough one. So I won't say anything more because I'll try and come back and address that probably in a coffee and concepts. Thank you very much for the question. All right, I'll leave it there. Thanks so much for checking in, and I'll talk to you all again soon. Bye-bye.